Okay, so weekend 5. And this weekend, we're really focusing on upholding rules and standards within our democracy. So as you know, the overall big reason that we're all here together and spending these weekends together is to really consider this overall big question of how should democracy in the UK work? And our questions really that we're focusing on for this weekend are, how should standards of ethical behaviour be upheld? And this is something that we've been touching on throughout the session so far. And to what extent should government and parliament be subject to legal limits? And we'll hear a bit more shortly about what that might mean in practice. So really the agenda for this weekend, we're following a similar pattern to the last couple of weekends. That Saturday morning, so we're going to be learning from the kind of informant speakers. So the speakers who are there to sort of outline the system as it stands, what things are and what options there are currently for upholding rules and standards. Saturday afternoon, we'll begin exploring some of the trade-offs of where the authority for making these types of decisions and upholding rules and standards should lie. And we'll have another set of speakers, and again, a bit of a panel discussion that starts teasing out some of the trade-offs or decisions that need to be made. And then on Sunday morning, we'll spend time mainly in the breakout rooms, drawing conclusions about what is needed to address these questions going forward. No, for some reason my screen has decided it won't move on. So just that reminder, you know, we're all getting pretty good at working together and hearing each other in these breakout rooms, but we do need to remember occasionally that, you know, everyone has that right to speak and to be listened to, and that, you know, we will disagree. And we've seen that already in several of the weekends, and that's great, because actually this is about testing out why we think what we think, why we have the opinions that we have, and whether actually with new information or new perspectives, some of those views might change. And again, these are the sort of conversation guidelines that you added to there. And I think, you know, one of the ones we really need to think about is that idea of, you know, having an open mind and recognizing, as I think you're realizing, the more people you meet across the different groups, we all bring different backgrounds, contexts, politics, things that are important to us. And so let's take this as an opportunity to learn and share those views. So on that basis, I'm going to stop talking, and I think we're ready to hand over to Alan to give us a bit of an introduction and context setting for this weekend.
Great, thank you very much. Very good to see everyone again. So yeah, I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction to this weekend and what we're doing, building on what Kayla has already said. So let me just share my screen there. So you're already familiar, I think, with the plan for the weekends as a whole. So we had those first 2 weekends when we were exploring the ideas overall by way of starting points. Now we're going through the various parts of the democratic system weekend by weekend. So at weekend 3, we looked at the roles of government and parliament. Last time we were looking at the roles of the public. And this time we are focusing, as Kayla said, on upholding rules and standards. So just what does that mean? Well, if you think back to weekend 2, when we were looking at what limits should be placed on government, there were various kind of basic principles that you were exploring and that you were coming up with in your discussions about things that we might want to protect in the system. So we might want to ensure that people in politics, people in positions of power, are following high standards of ethical behavior. That's something that's been very much in the news over the last few weeks as well. A lot of you were concerned as well about upholding basic rights. And there was also a point about protecting basic features of democracy. So we can't have Parliament just deciding to suddenly abolish elections, for example. So the question that we're focusing on in this weekend is really, if these are some of the things that we care about, how do we ensure that these things happen? How do we uphold standards? How do we protect basic features, basic principles? And in essence, there are 2 kinds of answers to that question. So one of those answers says we should do it through politics, and the other one says we need to do it, at least in part, through rules. So I'm just about to say what I mean by both of those things. Just before I do so, I should emphasize that I don't think anyone would say that it's a kind of either or choice between politics or rules, that we can have everything through one or the other. Everyone would say it's a matter of balance between these two things. So that's just worth bearing in mind. So what do I mean by upholding basic principles through politics? Well, basically, I mean doing it through those processes that we've been focusing on over the last 2 weekends, that process of the representative system, where we, the voters, elect our representatives in Parliament, and Parliament then forms the government. And then going in the other direction, government ministers are accountable to Parliament, and MPs in Parliament are accountable to us as voters. So one view says that it's that process of representation and accountability that best ensures that we can protect the basic principles that we care about. But then the other view would say that, well, that's maybe fine for many things, but it's not enough on its own. We need something in addition to that. And we also need a system of rules. And a system of rules basically has two parts. So it has the rules themselves, and there also needs to be some way of enforcing those rules, making sure the rules are actually followed. So when we're talking about rules, probably most obviously we're thinking about laws. So we're all subject to laws. People in power are also subject to laws, and the laws are enforced through the courts, of course. So the courts hear cases and decide whether the law has been broken or not. If they see that the law has been broken, then they're able to issue penalties. But there are many, many other kinds of rules. So Kayla's just set out our conversation guidelines for the Citizens' Assembly. In a way, those are kind of rules, but there's a softer form of rules than the hard law that I've mentioned already. And it's kind of the same in the world of politics as well. So in particularly when we're thinking about standards of ethical behavior, we also want to be aware of things that are called codes of conduct, which some of you will be aware of, that are often upheld, enforced, or at least monitored by regulators. Now that might be a little bit mysterious to some of you, to many of you, I suspect, just at the moment, but worry not, we will explore these things further over the course of the morning. And codes of conduct can come in many different forms. Sometimes they're quite close to being laws in terms of how kind of rigorous and strict they are. Other times they're a bit closer to our own conversation guidelines and being guidelines for how we ought to behave. So basically our question for this weekend is, for upholding basic principles, where should the balance lie between politics and rules for upholding those principles? But that's a really big question. So we want to break it down a bit. And we've got two main questions, as Kayla said at the start, that we're focusing in on. So those are the examples of principles that I offered at the start. So one of those was ensuring high standards of ethical behavior. And that actually relates directly to one of the questions that we're focusing on over the weekend. How should standards of ethical behavior, particularly among politicians, people in positions of power, be upheld? And then those other two principles that I mentioned, well, those are basically kind of examples of our second question, which is, to what extent should government and parliament be subject to legal limits? So let me just say a few words about each of those questions, starting off with the first one there. How should standards of ethical behavior be upheld? So we might be concerned, for example, about how can we best tackle corruption? We might be interested in asking, how can we ensure that politicians are honest? We might be thinking about what if a minister is accused of bullying officials? What should be done? And with something like corruption, you might think, well, clearly the law should be coming in there, just as if we're found to be corrupt, we would be subject to the law. So the same for people in positions of power. And therefore the law and the courts would be involved. If we're looking at something like honesty and dishonesty, though, do we really want the courts to be making rulings on what things politicians can and cannot say? Or might that actually be quite dangerous in a democracy for free speech? So these are the sorts of questions that we're going to be exploring around to what extent we can operate through politics or through rules for upholding the many different kinds of standards of ethical behavior that we might care about. And then there's the question, to what extent should government and parliament be subject to legal limits? So there are kind of two bits to that question, I suppose. There's one about government and there's one about parliament. So maybe worth just breaking those down and considering each in turn. I'll start off with parliament, actually. So one of the basic principles of the constitution that we've gone back to several times, goes right back to our first weekend when Parm introduced this concept of parliamentary sovereignty. So that's two very big long words, but basically parliamentary sovereignty means, in theory, the UK Parliament can pass any law it likes. Parliament can pass any law it might choose to introduce. So Parliament could, in theory, decide to abolish elections, or Parliament could, in theory, decide that it's going to ban eating any food on Tuesdays. You know, Parliament could do anything in theory. So what is it that stops Parliament from passing really crazy laws, from breaking those basic principles that we might think are important? Well, one view says that it's the political process that is the best protection against bad laws. So it's that process by which we are electing our representatives, we're choosing the members of parliament, and we're holding those members of parliament to account. So we are actually really important in upholding these basic principles, and our behavior really matters as well. But the other view says, well, no, actually, that's fine so far as it goes, but we need a little bit more, and argues that we need legal limits on the laws that Parliament can pass. So that's Parliament. And then on the government side, so government doesn't have sovereignty. Government ministers can only act within their powers. They can only do what they are allowed to do. So here's the question. The question is, how do we ensure that they do stick within those powers? And again, one view would say it's through the political process that we should do that. And the other view would say, well, actually, we need the judges who are enforcing the rules on what government ministers can do. So overall, we have the questions for the weekend. That first question, how should standards of ethical behavior be upheld, is, are these political processes of representation and accountability enough, or do we need something more? And then secondly, to what extent should government and parliament be subject to legal limits? And within that, we've got parliament. So should there be limits on the laws that parliament can pass? And government, how do we ensure that government ministers act within their powers? And that's what we're doing this weekend. Back to Kayla.
Thank you, Alan. So that gives you a bit of a starter point. And we're going to put you into breakout rooms at the moment, just to sort of get some first reflections and some first ideas and check in with the group that you're going to be working with. And as last weekend, or the last time we met, we're going to be staying with the same group for the whole weekend. So we might need to shift one or two people around to balance it up. There's a couple of people missing, and some groups might end up being a little bit small. So we might have to do a little shift shortly, but this should be the group you'll be working with for the whole weekend. So we'll open up now, and I'll see you in about 20 minutes or so. Hopefully people have had a chance now to sort of start thinking about some initial views around the topic, start talking to each other, and everyone now has sort of met the people that they're going to be working with over the weekend. I know a few people are having sort of some tech problems today, particularly I think exacerbated by the storms and the winds that we've had. So hopefully everyone can just be patient with each other, and we'll try and get through as best we can. But on that basis, I'm now going to hand over to Alan to introduce the first of our speakers for today.
Thank you, Kayla. So yeah, we've got 3 speakers this morning. So you know that we're focusing on this question about how do we uphold basic kind of standards and principles and so on. So the speakers are going to explore the various different ways in which it might be possible to do that. So I've just got one slide that I'm going to share very quickly here. So as I said earlier, we've got the 2 approaches of upholding basic principles through politics and through rules. So if we're talking politics, we're talking about those things that we've been talking about over the last couple of weekends. So we're going to have one talk exploring those again, and Meg Russell, who's very familiar to all of you, is going to give that talk. And then if we're looking at upholding those principles through rules, then we've got those 2 different kinds of rules that we talked about, the law and codes of practice. So the law and the courts, we're going to have one talk on those, and regulators will have a talk on those as well. So that is the plan for the talks this weekend. You'll have lots of time to think and discuss between each of those talks. So I'll hand over first to Meg to give the talk on political ways of upholding standards and basic principles.
Thank you very much, Alan. And just let me see if I can share my slides. Share screen. Here we go. Shout anybody if you can't see that. Otherwise, I'll assume that you can see my slides. So it's great to be back here again for this 5th weekend of the Assembly. And as Alan said, my role this morning is to talk about how the political parts of the system can help ensure standards are upheld. We should consider this before thinking about whether other additional kinds of constraints that the other speakers will consider are needed. So, as Alan said, the political constraints in the system are mostly things we've talked about in previous weekends. They're often quite subtle systems of influence that encourage accountability, transparency, and good behaviour. So if we return to the structure of government, which we discussed in the 3rd weekend, we know that at the heart of government are politically neutral civil servants reporting to ministers who are parliamentarians from the governing party or parties. These ministers are chosen by the Prime Minister, who decides whether they should keep their jobs. All ministers, including the Prime Minister, are also accountable to Parliament, attending regularly to answer questions and explain themselves. As we've discussed before, the government needs to retain what's formally called the confidence of the House of Commons. If it loses that, it can be removed from office. There are wider pressures as well within which Parliament sits. Parliament's a very public place. Journalists attend, there are TV cameras running, and decisions often reach the news. This supports the most crucial form of democratic accountability between members of Parliament and the voters. Voters can hold politicians accountable directly, for example, by writing to or meeting with their MPs, and they also access information via the news. If the voters are unhappy at the next general election, they can choose to vote against their local MP and maybe vote the whole government out of office. At every level in this system, policymakers know they're being watched and they have to be accountable. So ministers account to Parliament and also to the Prime Minister, who decides whether they can keep their jobs. The Prime Minister must also account to Parliament as well. And then all MPs are accountable to the media and to the voters. Now, hopefully people who become politicians have good motives and want to behave well. But the fact that whenever politicians take decisions, they have somebody looking over their shoulder and they need to explain themselves creates added incentives to good behaviour. So to take a particular example, if a minister does something inappropriate or just doesn't perform very well, they'll need to answer to Parliament. They'll also need to answer to the Prime Minister, who might decide to remove them from the government. In thinking about this, the Prime Minister will consider the merits of the case in terms of whether the minister deserves to go. But they'll also think about how the decision will look. If a Prime Minister chooses to keep a badly performing minister, they could be punished in Parliament, in the media, and by the voters. A particular question arises with respect to what happens if a minister or the Prime Minister lies to Parliament. At the moment, it's left purely to these kinds of political pressures to sort it out. That all applies to standards of good behaviour, which we've heard a lot about in recent weeks. Jane will say more about this shortly. But similar arguments apply to making policy and the law. As we've discussed before, Parliament oversees the policy proposals put forward by ministers. In the same public environment, with the media and pressure groups watching and the voters able to judge and vote the government out of office in due course if they don't like its policies. In the UK system, as Alan's reminded us, Parliament is officially sovereign, so sits at the top of the decision-making tree. This means its decisions can't normally be overturned, for example, by the courts, which Chris is going to speak about later. Many policy decisions are partly a matter of taste, but we do probably want to judge policies against some kind of standards as well. 3 important kinds of standards are kept under review by particular committees in Parliament. First, a committee considers whether bills proposed by the government give too much future power to ministers. You'll hopefully remember that we spoke in weekend 3 about secondary legislation, which gives ministers power to make future changes without the need for full parliamentary approval. Parliament has to decide whether to grant this, so the committee advises whether the powers being asked for by government are reasonable. Second, there's a committee that considers whether new policies are contrary to basic human rights. And a third committee considers whether new policies are problematic in terms of other constitutional standards. For example, maintaining free and fair elections or the right to a fair trial. It asks whether new policies fit with the traditions of our constitution. All three of these committees are just advisory. They report to Parliament, and Parliament as a whole takes the final decision. Because of parliamentary sovereignty, if MPs decide to support a government proposal that would breach any of these standards, that's really their decision to take. Like with ethical standards, they ultimately answer to the voters. The key question for this weekend is to what extent such decisions, both on standards of ethical behaviour and on policy, should be left to the political mechanisms I've described, or whether there should be other kinds of oversight and enforcement. Sorry, forgot to click on my slide there. It's very easy to make arguments on both sides. On the one hand, we might think political mechanisms of accountability through Parliament, the media, and the voters are the most democratic. There's a clear chain of responsibility from government to Parliament and Parliament to citizens, leaving citizens ultimately to decide. On the other hand, we might have some worries about the political checks. First, if the government has a party majority in Parliament, it might be too easy to persuade MPs to ignore unethical behaviour or to support decisions that, for example, harm minority rights. A lot will depend on how much MPs in the government's party are prepared to stand up to their leaders. Likewise, the media can be quite political, and even citizens might tolerate bad behaviour from a government that they support, or perhaps not even be watching carefully enough. So what should we do in response to these kind of concerns? If political processes don't decide matters, then who should? The next two talks are going to discuss this. But whichever system we choose, we need to remember that democracy depends on the support of the voters. There's a tension here. If the voters' views were completely overridden, they might turn against the democratic system. So we need a political process, but sometimes perhaps we also need to keep it in check. And if we think there's a role for unelected bodies in maintaining standards and good democratic behaviour, there'll always be difficult questions about where to draw the line. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Meg. So again, focusing there on the sort of political mechanisms that we do have at the moment to sort of uphold these rules and standards. I'm going to put you into your breakout rooms and just give you about 20 minutes or so to reflect on that. Remember, speakers are available if there's things you need to clarify, but also starting to consider, well, what are the risks of taking those types of decisions outside of the political system? So over to you.
Thank you, Kayla. Yes, so before the break there, we were talking about the ways in which politics might be able to uphold those basic standards and other basic principles. And now we're going to be moving on to the more rules-based approaches. So as I said before, there are two basic approaches to that, through the law and the courts, and the other through codes of practice and regulators and that kind of thing. And we're actually going to go first to the regulators and the role of regulators. And these are particularly important when we're thinking about ethical standards, that question about ethical standards of behavior among politicians and other people in positions of power. And because that's been so much in the news over the last few weeks, we thought it would be helpful to go there first, and then afterwards to go to the role of the law. So our speaker on these issues is going to be Dr. Jane Martin, and Jane is a member of the Committee on Standards in Public Life. And she'll explain herself what that committee is, but basically it's one of the regulators, and indeed it kind of sits at the center of the overall regulatory system. So she's got really great perspective on all of these matters. So over to you, Jane, and I'll share Jane's slides just once Jane has had a chance to introduce herself.
Thank you very much, Alan. It's really great to be here to take part in this great event today, so thank you. Yeah, if Alan's going to help me with my slide. So there you are, that's me on the first slide there. And as Alan has said, I'm a member of the Committee on Standards in Public Life. So if we just go straight to the next slide, Alan. What I want to do is try to build on Meg's presentation to give you an outline of how regulators help to support high standards. They're an important part of bringing checks and balances on what politicians do. But I want to start by just mentioning some big themes. The first one is that as well as having a system which supports compliance with high standards, it's also really important that we develop a good culture, the way things are done. And so we need to get a balance between those two things. It's also worth saying that regulation and the regulatory landscape has changed over time, certainly over the last 26 years, and it always has to reflect social attitudes. And I hope that will come out in the things I say in a moment. But certainly in the last 26 years, there's been quite a lot of changes. Many of them actually brought about by recommendations from my committee. And they have been in response to problems, crises, scandals that have come up along the way. And I'll just make reference to those. So it's important to understand that the way in which these things change is very much a reflection of the public's trust and confidence actually in politicians. As a result, then, we have quite a complicated mix of regulatory bodies, I should say. Some of them do have enforceable powers and some only advisory powers, and I'll pull that out as I go through my slides. And the final point is about recognising the delicate balance that has to be struck between the independence of the regulators and the supremacy of Parliament. Again, as Meg has said, the way in which we have done things in our constitution has been about the political accountability that she's mentioned this morning. But of course, recently we've seen, and this has come up through recent years, that people have been questioning whether that political accountability is still working, particularly in the last few months, I'm sure you're aware. So, if that's not working, then that raises questions about whether our regulatory framework is fit for purpose. And in fact, my committee's just done quite a big report on that. But let me take you through it. So next slide, please, Alan. I've mentioned I'm a member of Committee for Standards in Public Life, and these are the 7 principles of public life. Often you'll see referred to as the Nolan principles because they were established by my committee 26 years ago when it was first set up by the chair, who was then Lord Nolan. Now you can see here on the slide that there's selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, and leadership. I hope some of those are self-evident to you, but there are 3 that I'd just like to highlight, which I think are particularly relevant. First one is accountability. You've already heard quite a lot about that. But in a democratic system, it is, of course, essential that those representatives of the people are held to account for decisions that they take, for their behaviours, for the way in which policies are put together. The next one below that is openness, which is another word for transparency. And in our recent report, it became quite clear that we need government and Parliament to be much more transparent. It's what is expected in the world that we live in today. And finally, I want to just highlight respect. Leadership is the final principle there, but you'll see I've put in brackets including respect, and we have just made an amendment as a result of our recent work to the leadership principle to specifically include respect for others and the importance of treating all those that politicians work with, both their colleagues and their staff, with mutual respect. And so I just wanted to highlight that one. Next slide, please, Alan. So these principles inform much of the guidance and indeed the rules of the way in which public officials, those in public office, conduct themselves as they go about their business on behalf of the public. So there are 2 key elements of the system then. One is codes of conduct and the other is the independent regulators. So just to say something for a moment about the codes of conduct, these codes are guidance. A code is not, in most cases, enshrined in law. It's not legally enforceable, but it is guidance, usually put together by agreement between the parties concerned. Again, I'll come on to that a bit more in a moment. but they're not enforceable, but they are expected to be followed. The independent regulators themselves have been established, as I've said, often in response to problems that have occurred over the years. And they're there to encourage and promote compliance with high standards and to set the ground rules for a culture of high standards. The importance for the regulators, though, is that they need to have sufficient and appropriate independence and authority from the politicians in order to be effective, in order to be able to hold them to account. But at the same time, we have to recognise that there is a boundary that we must observe, where the politicians have legitimacy and where the influence and the advice of the regulators must end. So it's never a simple question, and I'm sure you'll want to discuss that much more in greater detail. Next slide, please, Alan. So in terms of codes of conduct then, as I've just said, the Nolan principles inform the codes of conduct, have very wide following. And there are many, but I just want to highlight the three here on this slide. So the first one is the House of Commons Code of Conduct for MPs. This is agreed by the Commons, so it's agreed by the politicians, by the representatives, so that they should see themselves as owning that code of conduct. It sets out the standards of behaviour that are expected. It sets out the guidance on additional income, and of course that's been very much in the news recently. It also sets out the rules about gifts and personal income, which should be declared, and the register of members' interests. I suppose in essence, the code encapsulates both high ethical standards, but also anything to do with conflicts of interest, anything to do with undue pressure on representatives through paid work or other gifts and hospitality. The same applies in the House of Lords, whereas there is a code of conduct for peers, which they have agreed and covers the same sort of territory. Not exactly the same documents, interestingly, because they have been developed in each of the separate houses, but that of course has its strengths. And the third one there is the Ministerial Code for Ministers, which I just want to say a little bit more about. That code covers two things, really. It does cover standards of behaviour that are expected, but it also covers much more procedural stuff about how ministers should and could operate. It's been described, therefore, as a hybrid document, and there are questions about whether that is quite the way for it to be constructed. The important thing about the ministerial code is that each prime minister, when a new prime minister comes into office, he or she reviews the code, and it is very much their code. These revisions aren't great, but it is nonetheless at the discretion of each prime minister to set that code precisely as they want it. And of course, it is also the case that the prime minister has the authority, the power, if you like, to decide about any breaches of that code. And it's worth pointing out, and this you'll be aware of this from the issue there was a case relating to Priti Patel as Home Secretary. The Prime Minister has an independent advisor who advises him on the ministerial code. And in relation to that case, in fact, the advisor resigned and we have a new advisor now. But the point at issue was that the independent advisor can independently investigate, but cannot decide on the breach, and certainly cannot decide on the resignation of a minister in the case of a breach. And that's, of course, the right thing, because the Prime Minister is the only person who can hire and fire ministers. But it's a very interesting territory to get the independence right. Thank you. Next slide, please. So let me go on then to the examples of independent regulators. And there are three columns here. So they give you examples of the different types of regulators. So the first one is the Committee on Standards in Public Life, which I've mentioned, which I'm a member. Now, this is an advisory committee, and there are a number of advisory bodies. The committee is made up of lay members, such as myself, appointed independently, although ultimately appointed by the Prime Minister, but appointed through a public appointments process, through an independent panel, and then approved by the Prime Minister. We are advisory, so we advise the Prime Minister and we make recommendations as a result of our report. Now, many of those recommendations are followed. We've been instrumental in setting up a number of the regulators that exist today, but that isn't necessarily the case. So, for example, recent reports that we have put to the government have not followed our recommendations. So we can only go so far. The second column there are bodies that I would say have been set up under parliamentary authority. So they're not advisory, but nor are they, if you like, legal bodies. The Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards, Catherine Stone currently holds that post. So that this arrangement was established by Parliament, agreed by Parliament. And so she has a role which has clear guidelines and a small staff to investigate complaints about the conduct of members of Parliament, members of the Commons. And then she makes recommendations. Now, she makes recommendations then to the Parliamentary Committee for Standards. You can see how this gets a bit complicated. And that's a parliamentary committee, obviously, for the House of Commons, agreed and established by the House of Commons. It's a cross-party committee, currently chaired by a Labour member, Chris Bryant, but also there are lay members on that committee. And they will look at the case. So, I mean, you will have seen this in relation to Owen Paterson. So the Parliamentary Commissioner conducted her investigation. She made her recommendations. They go to the Parliamentary Committee. The Parliamentary Committee considers it, brings forward their report and what they think should happen in terms of the sanctions. They bring that to a debate of Parliament. And that's what we saw just a couple of weeks ago, although it got rather confused in the end. But the process is that has to come to a debate of the House, of the full House. So this is a situation where MPs are judging their own. I mean, it's said, judged by their peers. So there's no independent, apart from the independent people on the committee, there's no greater independence in that system. And that obviously sometimes calls it into question, but that is the system that exists. And finally, I just want to highlight the Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority. This was only established quite recently, 2009, and it is a body of Parliament. It's overseen by the Speaker's Committee, which oversees all the work of the House, and that looks at MPs' expenditure and how they are handling their expenses, again in response to concerns that were raised. And finally, I'm probably taking too much time. Finally, there are two bodies on the other side, in the other column, which are legally based. The Electoral Commission looks at how elections are run and looks at donations to political parties, but that is created by a law in 2000, so it has a legal basis. And also there is a register of consultant lobbyists, another example. I thought it was worth mentioning lobbying. So that register was also established fairly recently. And all independent lobbyists, whether individuals or organisations, must register with this independent body, and the commissioner of the register owns that and will make sure that people are following the rules, are registering and are complying with the rules. So those bodies have a legal basis, are on much stronger footing, if you like, than the other types of bodies. So next slide, please, Alan, which is my final slide. I just want to highlight some of the key issues. For a regulator to be effective, these key issues need to be thought through very carefully. First one is that there is access to bring a case. So it's clear that if a member of staff, if another MP needed to bring a case, then they understand how they can do it and where they can go. Second point is about the impartial authority of regulators to investigate and a fair process. It's really important that the authority of for example, the commissioner, parliamentary commissioner, to be able to investigate impartially, and for that not to be interfered with by politicians, and for a fair process to be followed, not only for those who are bringing a complaint, but for those who are being complained about. It's really important that the regulators have independent authority to reach conclusions, again, so they are not fettered, they are not limited by parliamentary influence. They are free to draw their own conclusions. And then we have to think carefully about the authority to apply proportionate and appropriate sanctioning powers. The ministerial code is a good example here. In the past, it has been the case that, generally speaking, a minister would have resigned if they'd breached the code. Now the committee is saying, and it's generally regarded to be the case, that there might be a range of sanctions which are more proportionate to the breach that has occurred. But as I said right at the outset, for example, with ministers, only the Prime Minister can make that decision in the end. And last but not least, when there are significant sanctions being applied, it is important to think about a process of appeal. And that occurs in some cases, but not in others. I'm sure I've covered my time scale now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane. I am going to put you straight into the breakout rooms, just to spend a bit of time considering what you've heard from Jane and how this fits into the wider understanding of how we do sort of uphold rules and standards across government and parliament. And remember, speakers are available if there's things you want a bit more information on. So over to you. So I know there were lots of questions, and there were groups that still didn't get some of their questions answered in that last discussion. All of our speakers are still around, so you can still be asking questions through the next one as well. But we are going to hear now from our final speaker, putting the jigsaw together and really focusing a bit more on the sort of role of courts and regulations. So, Alan.
Thank you, Kayla. Yes, so our final speaker is Dr. Chris McCorkindale, who's from the University of Strathclyde. And as Kayla said, Chris is going to focus in this time on the role of law and the courts. So in the last session with Jane, we were focusing on regulators, and that was mainly to do with our first question around how we can uphold standards of ethical behavior in politics. When we move over to the role of law and courts, we're mainly thinking about the other question about what limits should there be, if any, on what government and parliament are able to do. So remember those two questions that we have within that about parliament and about government. So Chris is going to introduce us to how the system works there. Chris, over to you.
Thanks, Alan. I'll just start this slideshow. So pleasure to be here and really thankful for the invite and the chance to speak to you, and I hope you've enjoyed it so far. I just want to start by highlighting two differences from what you'll see in here today in the title slide. So first of all, I have considerably less hair than I did when the photo was taken that's used in the title slide. Secondly, although the title refers to the role of the courts, what we're going to focus on here is a particular court procedure, that is actions for judicial review. Actions for judicial review are the main mechanism for setting legal standards of good government, and also for holding government to account where they fall short of those legal standards. And I'll do this just by asking and answering a series of questions that I hope will help you to focus on the key issues that you'll want to discuss. Now, the first question we'll ask is, what is judicial review? And we might as well start with Lord Bingham, the first president of the UK Supreme Court, which opened in 2009, who said that judicial review is a process by which courts enforce compliance with law by government. A process by which courts enforce compliance with law by government. Now that invites us to think through a series of following questions. So first of all, who are the judges who sit in court and hear these judicial review cases? The judges who sit in judicial review cases are the senior judiciary. The senior judiciary, unfortunately, is still mostly white, is still mostly male, are still mostly from privileged social and economic backgrounds that include the schools and universities that they attended. And if we look at recent data on diversity in the judiciary, focusing on England and Wales just for reasons of restrictions of time, we can see that 29% of the senior judiciary are women, just 29% of the senior judiciary are women, and only 2 of 12 Supreme Court justices are women. We can see that 4% of the senior judiciary are Black, Asian, or minority ethnic, and no Supreme Court justices are Black, Asian, or minority ethnic. And we can see similar patterns, indeed in some cases worse statistics where judicial review applies in Scotland and in Northern Ireland. And that matters because if we are talking here about the power of the judiciary, it's important to think about who the judiciary are. Who is it that's enforcing these limits on government, and how might their backgrounds and where they come from influence them in the way in which they exercise that power, limiting what and empowering whom. So how do they get there? What we've seen over the last few years is a transition from very informal and secretive appointments processes, where the judiciary is heavily involved in appointments and effectively self-replicates, right? Where the judiciary and senior lawyers tended to choose people and appoint people who looked like them and to fill these judicial positions. But now what we see is a move towards far more formal, far more transparent processes that are driven by independent appointment bodies, which have clear and published criteria and processes, with fewer opportunities for conscious or unconscious bias in the selection of judges. That hasn't yet filtered through fully to a more representative and diverse senior judiciary, but over time we hope that these more transparent, informal processes will have something of that effect. And when the judges get there, well, when judges are appointed, there are various means of securing the independence of the judiciary against government interference. Two of the key mechanisms of doing that is, first of all, security of tenure. The government cannot sack judges if those judges don't fall into line with the government view. Judges can only be removed in very exceptional circumstances and with the approval of the legislature. Similarly, protection of salary. The government can't cut or threaten to cut the salary of judges where judges refuse to fall into line behind the government view. And so in these ways and in various other ways, the judges are able to be protected from government interference and to hold an independent position and wield that power independently. Now, if judicial review is about setting and upholding standards of legality, then when is an act or omission by government unlawful? Well, when the government acts without lawful authority, when, for example, government's secondary legislation goes beyond the powers given to the government by Parliament, then it will be held to be unlawful. Right? And this can apply in a number of ways. First of all, by the government misunderstanding and incorrectly applying its powers, not understanding or incorrectly applying the powers given to them, where the government acts irrationally, where it acts in defiance of logic or accepted moral standards, such that no reasonable body or decision maker could possibly have arrived at the same decision, where the government acts in a procedurally unfair way. So, for example, by showing bias towards one party and not another when decisions are made, where certain classes of promises are broken or made and broken by the government, and where a government decision or action disproportionately interferes with individuals' rights under the European Convention on Human Rights, the ECHR. So what's the implication or the consequence of a finding that government has acted unlawfully? Well, the first and most important implication here is that a decision that is unlawful, that the court holds to be unlawful, is null and void. That's to say that it's treated as though it was never made, the decision was never made, and as if the decision never had any legal effect. If the government ignores a court order, then ministers might be subject to contempt of court proceedings, a very serious form of proceeding. But what we mostly find is that there's a culture of compliance with court proceedings in the UK, even if it's a culture of comply and complain. Now, that doesn't necessarily always mean compliance with the spirit of a judgment. So in recent years, we've seen quite a troubling trend, I think, where courts have held against the government and where the government's response is not to remedy or not to correct the unlawful act, but to make it lawful by passing primary legislation, by passing an act of parliament that says this action that the court held was unlawful is now lawful and was always lawful. And because that is passed by an act of parliament rather than simply by secondary legislation or other government action, it is not subject, as we'll see, to judicial review by the courts. In other words, the discussion is stopped, the action was lawful. So as I said, what about the review of legislation? We've talked about the review of government action, including secondary legislation. But what about review of primary legislation, acts of parliament or acts of the devolved legislatures? Well, traditionally, the view of the courts was that there was no possibility to judicially review acts of parliament. The courts said that acts of parliament are the law. They are the highest form of law in this country. And so it's impossible for an act of parliament to be unlawful, to be unconstitutional, and therefore to be struck down by the courts. But there's a change in that attitude. There's a change in that position. Sometimes that's because of legislation, courts being given powers to review legislation. Sometimes that's because of powers that the judges take or claim for themselves to review legislation. I've got some examples here. The Human Rights Act in 1998 allows for a soft review of the compatibility of acts of parliament with the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, why I call that a soft review of primary legislation is because the courts don't have a right to strike down, to invalidate primary legislation that is not compatible with the European Convention on Human Rights. But they can issue a declaration of incompatibility. They can say that legislation passed by Parliament is incompatible with convention rights, and then the question passes to Parliament. So what, if anything, are you going to do about that? The position is different again when it comes to acts of the Scottish and Welsh Parliament or the Northern Irish Assembly. Where we're talking about devolved primary legislation, the courts can strike down that legislation, can invalidate that legislation, where it's incompatible with convention rights, or where the legislation refers to policy areas that are reserved to the Westminster Parliament, that only Westminster and not the devolved legislatures can legislate for. But judges themselves have started to take or make claims for judicial power quite beyond the powers given to them, to the courts by Parliament. So judges have indicated that if extreme legislation, such as legislation to abolish judicial review itself, was passed by Parliament, then the judges might reserve for themselves to strike that legislation down, might overturn the traditional view of no judicial review and strike that law down as being incompatible with the rule of law itself, the rule that government and Parliament should act according to substantive legal standards. Now, again, where government ignores, or where Parliament ignores these judicial findings, there's a high culture of compliance. Even if the government doesn't like it, there will tend to be some form of reform of the law, but that might be a culture of compliance and complaint, which undermines the independence of the judiciary or confidence in the judiciary. How does the judicial review in the UK sit in a wider context? Well, if we look first of all at the context of the UK, the powers of the judiciary have ebbed and flowed over time. In the early 20th century, we had a very weak form of judicial review. Judges took seriously a very rigid separation of powers, did not want to involve themselves in the political arena, strayed away from contentious political cases. And the government wanted to keep the judges, white, upper class, privately educated men, away from their construction of the welfare state, because they didn't think that judges from that background would be sympathetic to the redistributive potential of the welfare state. In the 60s and 70s, we saw a much stronger development of judicial review led by the courts themselves, who expanded or who contracted the limits of legality and who more robustly stood up to government, but not yet to Parliament. In the early 21st century, we see robust review of government powers and, as I've said before, some moves in the direction of review of Parliament, especially in the area of human rights. Now, on the back of some really seriously contentious political cases, particularly around the area of Brexit, There's signs of pushback by the government, attempts by the government to rein in the judges by limiting who can raise judicial review actions, by limiting what judges can do and find unlawful. And we've also seen a retreat by the courts because they see this attack by the government coming. And so their response has been to rein themselves in to avoid the worst of that backlash, to be a bit more deferential to government, to be a bit more deferential to Parliament. So the current position, the current makeup of powers of judicial review that we know right now is neither inevitable nor is it static. It's not inevitable, it doesn't have to be this way, and it's not static. It will not always be this way because we know that the powers of the judiciary will ebb and flow. Internationally, we see a very mixed picture. In some jurisdictions, in some countries, we see very strong judicial review of legislation, for example, in the USA, some soft review of legislation similar to what we've seen in the UK and Canada or New Zealand, and in some cases, no review of legislation at all. Indeed, review of legislation is unconstitutional in the Netherlands. So again, the current balance of judicial power in the UK is neither inevitable nor is it static. So now over to you then. What is the main issue that you need to address over this weekend, at least in relation to judicial power? What is the appropriate role of the judiciary in a constitutional democracy? Do you prefer the current balance of strong review of government and only soft review of democratically enacted legislation? Are judges independent guardians of the Constitution whose powers should be strengthened in very challenging political times? Or should the powers of white, male, privileged and unelected elite to interfere in politics be curtailed? These are all live debates, all options on the table, and I look forward to seeing what you have to say about it. Thanks very much.
Okay, so we've just got a very small amount of time before we finish for lunch, but we're going to pop you back in your breakout rooms to sort of start having you think about some of these questions, some of these issues. Speakers are available, and we'll have some more time after lunch to sort of step back and start seeing the big picture. So over to you.